really broke them. What do you know?
Rock stars in the 80s looked free on stage. They smashed guitars. They screamed at crowds. Fans thought they lived without rules. The truth was different. Parents got angry about the song lyrics. They formed groups to fight back. Soon, government hearings began. Albums got warning labels. Radio stations banned songs. Artists had to change their words. Let's go into the details of bizarre rules rock stars had to follow in the 80s. Back in the wild days of 1980s, rock, putting on a concert, wasn't just about lights, sound, and fans screaming in the front row. It was also about the fine print. Those strange, often outrageous requests bands would sneak into their tour contracts. These weren't just for show. They were a game, a warning, and sometimes a brilliant way to test how seriously a venue took its job. Van Halen's "No Brown M&Ms" demand became the stuff of legend. To the outside world, it looked ridiculous. Why would one of the biggest rock bands in the world care about the color of candy? But this wasn't about candy at all. David Lee Roth, the band's frontman, later revealed the real reason. That one line in their rider was a trap. If brown M&Ms showed up in the bowl, it told the band something dangerous. The promoter didn't read the rider carefully. And if they missed that, what else did they miss? Maybe the voltage for the lighting rigs. Maybe the weight limits for the stage. Maybe something that could get someone hurt. So, while it sounded like diva nonsense, it was actually a brilliant way to sniff out laziness and protect everyone involved. But Van Halen wasn't the only band using their backstage demands as secret tools. Around the same time, Motley Crue was shaking things up with riders that made people laugh, shake their heads, or both. One famous list included a submachine gun, a 12-foot boa constrictor, and a jar of gray poupon mustard. Was it serious? Probably not. But the point was clear. These guys wanted to know if the people running the show were paying attention. And if someone showed up backstage with the mustard but no snake, well, maybe they missed something more important too. Other rock acts joined in the fun. Some asked for drapes in one exact color. Others wanted fog machines loaded with a certain number of gallons of fluid. One band demanded the right to jam on the venue's speakers during downtime. Another wanted a makeup artist on standby. Some wanted top-shelf alcohol, only glass-bottled soda or fruit juices from obscure islands. None of this was random. It was all part of the game. Tour managers, the ones who really made the shows happen, understood the trick. These weird demands weren't just ego trips. They were warning flares. If a promoter could pull off every silly request, it meant they'd likely followed the rest of the contract. The part that actually mattered, like sound checks, lighting specs, and fire exits. But if the rider was half done or ignored, that promoter had just told the band, without saying a word, "We're not ready." In fact, some bands wrote their riders like puzzles on purpose. Van Halen wasn't just tossing in candy requests for fun. They used it as a filter. If a venue couldn't get the easy part right, why would they trust them with the hard stuff? And for big bands, the stakes were sky high. One mistake could wreck the show, cause an accident, or damage millions in gear. That's why some contracts even gave bands the right to cancel if their rider wasn't followed. Before the crowd ever saw the lights flash or heard a single guitar riff, something strange was already happening backstage. The mood had to be just right. The smell, the lighting, the food, every single thing had to match a rock star's expectations, down to the tiniest detail. If even one thing was off, it could mean disaster. This wasn't just ego. For many of these bands, these rituals became a part of their performance, a sacred routine, and sometimes it got really weird. Take the Rolling Stones. To the fans, they were legends. But to the tour staff, they were chefs, caretakers, and mood managers. Keith Richards had one simple demand: a shepherd's pie. But not just any pie. It had to be made with lamb, not beef. It had to be perfectly seasoned. And it had to be his. One night in 1989 in Toronto, Keith found out someone had eaten his pie. That was it. He refused to go on stage. Not until a brand new pie was baked from scratch. Everyone panicked. The show was hanging by a thread, all over a pastry. Eventually, a fresh one was made, and only then did Keith agree to walk out and play. Some say the story got exaggerated over the years, but those who were there say it felt very real. That's how serious it was. And that wasn't even the end of it. Every single member of the Stones had their own custom meal, carefully packed in separate containers. Nothing could be oversalted. Nothing could be undercooked. Even the plates and forks were sometimes specified in the contract. It wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual. And the Stones weren't alone. Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses had his own version of pre-show magic. When the band played in Belgrade in 2010, his dressing room had to be painted completely black. Not dark. Black. The furniture had to match. Black bed, black sofa, black lamps. Then came the roses. 18 red, 18 white. Not 17, not 19, 18 each. Promoters had to count them out. Then came the drinks. Patron tequila, Grey Goose vodka, and, oddly enough, 2 bear-shaped honey bottles. There were also 6 bottles of Lucky Buddha beer and 6 of Grolsch. His fruit bowl had to include blackberries and mangosteens. The request list was so detailed, it read like a grocery list written by someone with OCD. But if anything was missing, the risk was clear. No show. Axl didn't compromise. If the ritual wasn't respected, there could be consequences. It wasn't just about luxury. Sometimes it was about control. Other times it was superstition. Some bands had their own quirky demands. AC/DC, for example, reportedly asked for big slabs of steak before every show. Angus Young once requested a pizza with bacon and pepperoni, but it had to be sliced into squares, not triangles. Nobody asked why. That's just how he liked it. Def Leppard supposedly had someone backstage whose only job was to peel bananas for Axl Rose. Whether that's true or not, it shows the kind of stories that start to grow around these legends. Even the snacks weren't safe from scrutiny. Some bands, like Van Halen, had one rule that became famous around the world. No brown M&Ms. None. If the band walked in and saw a single brown candy in the bowl, it was a red flag. Why? Because that one detail meant the venue might have skipped reading the full technical guide. It meant someone hadn't taken the time to understand the lighting requirements, the stage structure, or the sound system. It was a test. A tiny, colorful test that could cost promoters millions if they failed. And this went beyond food. Bands didn't just eat a certain way. They wanted the air to feel a certain way too. Some groups had roadies blast their favorite albums backstage before the show began. Not for fun, but as part of a warm-up ritual. It set the mood like a personal theme song. Others lit candles or burned incense in every dressing room, creating a vibe that felt safe and familiar, no matter where they were in the world. Some banned fluorescent lights near the stage. Too harsh, they said. Others asked that no one wear black rubber soles. Why? They believed it drained the energy from the room. It all might sound like madness, but there was logic behind it. These weren't just demands. They were part of a larger routine that helped performers feel in control. When you're in a different city every night, sleeping in a different bed, walking into a different venue, the only thing you can control is your ritual. And for many, it became sacred. Something they carried from one tour to the next, one missed detail, and everything felt off. Back in the mid-1980s, while bands were busy dealing with stage setups, hotel drama, and crazy tour demands, a much bigger war was brewing outside the concert halls. This one wasn't about lights or sound systems. It was about control. And it all started with a group of powerful Washington wives who thought music had gone too far. Leading the charge was Tipper Gore, the wife of then-Senator Al Gore. One day, she heard her daughter listening to Prince's song Darling Nikki. It shocked her. The lyrics were too explicit for her liking, and she was convinced something had to be done. So, she joined forces with other well-connected women and created the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center. To them, rock and heavy metal had turned into something dangerous. They believed songs were corrupting the youth with themes of sex, violence, and rebellion. So they made a list. They called it the Filthy 15. These were the songs they believed were the worst of the worst. Prince was on there. So was Mötley Crüe. Even Twisted Sister made the cut, not for anything vulgar, but for daring to promote rebellion with their anthem, "We're Not Gonna Take It." That was enough to set off alarm bells. But this wasn't just some casual complaint. The PMRC had political power. They pushed hard, and by August 1985, 19 major record labels caved. They agreed to put parental guidance, explicit lyrics stickers on certain albums. For the first time in music history, a warning label would tell people what was too risky to hear. Then came the Senate hearing. On September 19, 1985, the United States Senate did something strange. It held a formal hearing, not about war or economy, but about rock music. The room filled with senators, educators, reporters, and, in a surreal twist, 3 musicians who couldn't have been more different. First came Dee Snider, the wild-haired frontman of Twisted Sister. Then Frank Zappa, the sharp-tongued musical genius with no filter. And finally, John Denver. Yes, that John Denver, the soft-spoken country singer. Most people expected these musicians to fall apart under pressure, but that's not what happened. Dee Snider, wearing a denim vest and full rock star hair, calmly pulled out a piece of paper and read his testimony. He said his song Under the Blade was about surgery, not torture or violence. He explained it wasn't written to scare kids, it was about fear and recovery. Then he turned the tables. He said he had 5 younger sisters, and he'd never make music that would harm them. In that moment, he wasn't a shock rocker. He was a protective big brother. Then Frank Zappa stepped in, and he wasn't interested in playing nice. He mocked the whole thing. To him, this wasn't about helping parents, it was about government control. He warned that putting stickers on music was just the beginning, and that the real goal was to decide what people could or couldn't hear. He called it the beginning of the end for artistic freedom. And then there was John Denver. People thought he'd support the PMRC. After all, his music was about sunshine and mountains. But Denver shocked everyone. He compared the PMRC's efforts to Nazi book burnings. He said he'd once had one of his songs misunderstood and banned, and it hurt. He didn't want that to happen to anyone else, even artists he disagreed with. The 3 of them didn't agree on music styles. They didn't dress the same or speak the same. But that day, they were united. They weren't just defending rock. They were defending the right to express yourself, even if that expression made some people uncomfortable. After the hearing, the PMRC got what it wanted. The labels stayed. The stickers became part of the music industry. But something had shifted. Artists began to fight back with words, songs, and lawsuits. Fans started seeing the label as a badge of honor. If an album had a warning, it probably meant it was worth hearing. In the end, the PMRC thought they were protecting kids. But what they really did was spark one of the biggest conversations about censorship in modern history. And oddly enough, it was 3 very different musicians, Snider, Zappa, and Denver, who stood at the front lines of that fight, using their voices in the most unexpected way. When the PMRC hearings ended, they hadn't actually banned a single record. But the damage, or the change, depending on how you look at it, was already done. A small sticker quietly appeared on certain album covers. It read, "Parental Advisory." At first, it showed up on heavy metal and rap albums. Nothing seemed forced. No new law had been passed. But the pressure was there. Record labels didn't want bad publicity, so they played it safe. They started slapping the sticker on without being told to. In trying to avoid a fight, they gave the PMRC exactly what it wanted. But musicians didn't just sit back and accept it. Some laughed at the whole thing. John Lydon, the wild frontman once known as Johnny Rotten, mocked the idea. He pointed out how strange it was that people ignored real problems, like guns and pollution, yet got angry over a few curse words in a song. Others fought back with guitars and microphones. Judas Priest didn't hide their response. They wrote a full song called Parental Guidance, aimed straight at Tipper Gore and her mission to clean up music. The lyrics were cheeky and defiant, the perfect comeback. Other bands went even harder. Flotsam and Jetsam, an Arizona thrash band, dropped a song called Hard on You. Megadeth followed with Hook and Mouth, directly calling out the PMRC. The message was loud and clear. They weren't going to be quiet. Ironically, the more the PMRC tried to silence them, the more attention these bands got. Before the hearings, some of these groups barely registered on the mainstream radar. Now they were front-page stories. Kids who had never heard of these artists were suddenly curious. What was so dangerous about this music? Why were adults so afraid of it? Instead of hiding in fear, musicians embraced the sticker. It became a badge of honor. If your album had that black and white label, it meant you were pushing boundaries. It meant you were saying something bold, something real. That little sticker told fans, this music is not afraid. Suddenly, being labeled explicit was cool. It helped sales instead of hurting them. And over time, the whole thing became a legend. The 80s censorship war turned into part of rock history. The hearings didn't kill the music. They fed it. They gave rebellious artists a stage. They gave angry kids something to rally around. What was meant to shut people up only made them louder. What was meant to control music ended up giving it more power. In the end, musicians didn't lose their voices. They found them. They wrote whatever they wanted. They said what they felt. And they never stopped. That was the real legacy of the PMRC. They tried to tame the wild spirit of rock and roll, but they only made it roar louder. Behind the smoke and flashing lights, rock stars in the 1980s clung to strange habits like lifelines, superstitions, rituals, tiny routines that made no sense to outsiders, but felt like everything to them. Take Ozzy Osbourne. People say he wouldn't sleep with anyone for days before a show. He thought it drained his energy. Some laughed it off as nonsense. But it wasn't just Ozzy. This idea that holding back made you stronger had been around for centuries. Ancient warriors believed the same thing. And Ozzy, in his own way, felt like one of them, battling the stage every night, screaming his soul into the crowd. Others had different quirks. A guitarist might avoid using the same entrance twice. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe it was a way to stay sharp, to avoid going through the motions. A drummer might tap every drum 7 times before sound check. Sound checks, for some, turned into sacred rituals. Before the real crowd arrived, the band would play something strange. Maybe a Beatles song, maybe a forgotten fan favorite. Not because they needed to, because it felt lucky, like setting the right mood. The roadies played along. They knew the rules. You don't question these things. You don't touch someone's gear the wrong way. You don't move the lucky mic stand. One veteran roadie told the story of a bluesman who demanded quarters placed on every guitar's fretboard before tuning. No one asked why. They just did it. Better safe than cursed. Tour managers knew better than to fight it. These weren't just rock stars. They were bundles of nerves in leather jackets. Sometimes the only thing keeping them steady was the ritual. On the outside, they looked loud and wild. On the inside, they were trying not to fall apart. Inside the tour bus, it got even stranger. Some bandmates lit incense. Some stared out the window in silence. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Lucky coins, tattered shirts, old bandanas. These became armor. One singer swore he couldn't perform without his grandfather's belt buckle on. Another always stood in the same exact spot on stage. If someone moved his mark, he'd feel off all night. Even the little things mattered. The order of names on the set list, the layout of guitar pedals. Some musicians lined them up in patterns they never explained. Maybe it meant nothing, or maybe it meant everything. No one asked too many questions. Rituals gave the chaos structure. They gave the fear a name. And for bands living out of suitcases, never knowing which city they'd wake up in, that tiny bit of control felt like magic. Even if it wasn't real, it worked. It calmed the hands before the solo. It settled the stomach before the scream, and that was enough. They never talked about it in interviews. You wouldn't see it in behind-the-scenes footage, but if you stood close enough backstage, you'd notice. Every time a rock band arrived in a new city, something strange happened. On the first night, the show was always a little shorter, not because the band was tired, not because the crowd wasn't good, but because they were playing it safe. Some called it tradition. Others called it superstition. The road crew had a saying, "Break the gear in, or the gear breaks you." So they'd cut a few songs, just enough to ease into the space. The amps, the lights, the stage, they all needed a soft launch. Sacrifice a little now to avoid disaster later. That was the idea. Most fans never knew. They just thought the show was tight. But backstage, it was a ritual, a kind of offering to the touring gods. And that was just the beginning. Some bands took it further. If there was even a single cigarette butt on the stage before the show, they'd delay the set. Some wouldn't even play until the venue owner handed them the first guitar pick of the night. Not a roadie, not a tech. The owner. It was about control, about luck, about holding the chaos back with whatever small magic they could find. These weren't things written in contracts or rider sheets. They weren't meant for fans to see. But to the band, they were serious, like armor. Some would hum a certain note before sound check. Others wouldn't eat a full meal before going on stage. Not because they were too nervous, but because the last time they ate heavy before a gig, something went wrong. Maybe the mic died. Maybe the bass amp exploded. Maybe someone tripped. It didn't matter. A bad night meant something was off. So they remembered, and they adjusted. If the ritual worked once, it became law. That's how touring life was, full of noise and motion and unpredictability. Anything that made it feel safer, more stable, was worth clinging to. It sounds silly when you say it out loud, but when you're thousands of miles from home, sleeping on buses, living out of bags, and stepping into a new city every other night, routine becomes survival. A chant before the lights dimmed, a handshake done a certain way, a candy dish filled with only red licorice. It all meant something. Even silence had power. Some bands made it a rule. No talking for 5 minutes before walking on stage. No one really knows when these habits started. Maybe it was one guitarist who noticed that every time he wore his black boots, the solos hit harder. Or a drummer who believed playing a certain fill during sound check set the whole night right. Maybe it didn't matter. The belief was the point. And once enough people believed, it became real. Even now, years later, those stories survive, passed around like old songs. Some say they're just myths. Others swear they lived there. A tour manager might tell you about the time a broken pick ruined a whole set, or how one band refused to go on because the M&Ms weren't separated by color. People laugh at that one, but for the band, it wasn't about candy. It was about knowing someone paid attention, that every detail was checked, that everything was in place. Because the second something small slips through, something bigger might follow. And in rock and roll, when the margin for error is razor thin, that fear becomes fuel. So they followed the rituals. They adjusted the lights. They tested the power. They said the quiet words, all in the name of the show, all to keep the engine running, all to chase that one perfect night where everything felt alive. And if that meant skipping a song, cleaning the stage, or waiting in silence before plugging in, so be it. Better to keep the streak alive than roll the dice on fate